Hi, this is Melissa Talma and welcome to my video on basic watercolor techniques. Watercolor is a wonderful medium that has some truly unique qualities to it. Some of these are its vibrant color, its transparency, and its relative ease of use. Watercolor comes in several different forms. Some of these are tube colors, like these shown here, highly concentrated liquid color, which may come in jars or small squirt bottles like these. And it also comes in pan sets or pan form. Some of the supplies I'll be using in my video today are my watercolor paints, my palette, some sponges, a tissue, masking fluid, masking tape, squirt bottle, cotton swabs, alcohol, a variety of mark-making implements such as paintbrushes, toothbrushes, a stick, a straw, plastic silverware, and regular table salt. Good quality watercolor paper is thick enough so that when you apply water and paint, it won't warp the paper. Of course, we cannot forget our most important element, water. So in front of me I have taped down a 9x12 sheet of watercolor paper with 21 sections marked off for each of the techniques I'm going to demonstrate. I'm starting in the upper left with the solid wash. I'm using paint that's been mixed with water so that it flows nicely, and I have my board tipped at a slight angle. I'm using a large flat wash brush so that I get even distribution of color. You can also do a solid wash with a round brush or a mop brush. It just takes a little bit of practice to get large flat areas of color. Where the paint drips at the bottom, I'm just collecting that with a little bit of the brush tip. For the graded wash, I'm also using the flat brush. And just like with the solid wash, you want a consistency of paint that flows easily. But instead of gathering more paint on the brush, I'm just using clear water to slowly grade the effect down. The more water that you add to the watercolor paint, the more transparent or lighter it will appear on the paper. This technique does take a little while to perfect, so make sure that you're practicing in order to get an excellent quality graded wash. Glazing is a multi-step process, so I'm putting the first color down that we will go over a little bit later on in the video. Now I'm going to add a little bit of the masking fluid onto this section because we have to let it dry before we can paint over it, and then at that point, the paint will have to dry before the masking fluid can be removed. To apply masking fluid, you want to use an old unimportant paintbrush or some sort of tool like an eraser or possibly even a rubber clay tool or something similar to that, because it will ruin any good brushes that you might have. Now I'm applying a few pieces of masking tape to show the effect that you can get when you mask off an area and trim it with a sharp blade or an X-Acto knife. And you can use this technique for areas where you want to preserve the white of the paper or save areas that you want to remain a lighter color if you're going over a large area with a darker color. I'm putting paint in areas where we're going to come back to them later for a two-step process. So first of all, I'm putting paint on the lift out in a dry area, and then I'm putting some paint down where we're going to erase some of it with the magic eraser. Negative painting is another technique that's a multi-step process, so I'm just putting a little bit of color down in this area that I'll go over later. For the wet on wet area, I'm wetting the paper with some clear water, though mine still has a little bit of paint left in it. And then I'm just dropping wet paint onto it, and you can see that the edges are real fuzzy and soft. And this creates some beautiful, unpredictable effects. Part of the beauty of watercolor is its unpredictability, and doing the wet on wet technique, you're never really sure what your end result is going to be. You can get similar soft edges and fuzziness with the drop color on a wet area. And I painted the background blue here, and I'm taking another color and I will drop the paint right on it, and it causes this nice fuzzy texture that could be used in foliage or animal fur or many techniques in various paintings. Wet on dry is the technique you use when you want nice crisp edges or detail areas. The paint is wet and goes on the dry paper and allows you a lot of control. The section labeled brush techniques is an area where you can try out various shaped paintbrushes. This is a round paintbrush, and as you can see, you can get a detail line or various scalloped effects. If I use a flat brush, then I can get some variation of line widths. I can get large shapes like this with crisp edges. I can go on the edge of the brush for fine lines, or I can move the brush around to create a variety of different effects. If I use a rigger brush or a fine detail brush, I can create very fine lines that are useful when you're painting something with fine line texture such as fur or foliage, branches, even lettering. The dry brush technique is where your paper is dry and your brush has only a little bit of paint on it. Usually you dip your brush in the paint and then blot off the majority of the moisture. It creates sort of a scratchy effect, and again is useful for adding texture to various places in a painting and even to layer over other colors in the background. In this section, we're going to sponge on the color. I'm dipping a natural sponge in water, and then I'm dipping it in the paint. And you can see you get a nice textured effect with this. I'm repeating the same steps with a synthetic sponge because the effect is a little bit different. I'm laying down some color in this area. I will be scratching into the paint while it's damp on one side, and then we'll come back to it at the end and I will scratch into it when it's completely dry. So the tools that I'm using for scratching, it really could be anything. This is a plastic fork, and the paint goes in the grooves, as you can see. If you press a little bit harder, then you can actually scratch into the paper. I used a stick to create those lines. You can use the end of a paintbrush. You can even sharpen the end of a paintbrush and a pencil sharpener for some effects. In the water splatter area, I'm kind of just experimenting with a bunch of different ways to apply water and paint. I used a spray bottle to spray it and just put paint on. I'm tapping a paintbrush to get some splatters, And then I'm going to use a toothbrush here very carefully to splatter some paint on. There's no way to control the effect that you get here. You end up having to wipe out some color where you don't want it necessarily, or maybe you get a little bit too much paint in an area. In this area, I'm pushing out the color starting from the bottom, and I'm just kind of flicking the color upward to create what looks like a grassy texture. You can also put some wet paint on this bottom area and then use a straw to blow it. This is an unpredictable technique that can be a lot of fun, especially if you're looking for some random patterns or mixed colors on your paper to start with. For hard and soft edges, I'm using the wet on dry to create these nice crisp hard edges in this shape. And for the soft edges, instead of wetting the paper in advance, I'm putting the paint on dry paper, but then I'm going to go back over the edges with a wet paintbrush and just dilute the edge of that to create a feathered or soft effect on the edge. For another way to make soft edges, you can use a stiff dry brush or a scrubber brush, and that will create a little bit different effect than the wet paintbrush. Part of learning to use watercolor paint is learning how to remove it from your painting. This can be on purpose or it could be to correct a mistake. Here I put paint down and I'm wiping it out with a damp brush while the paint is still damp, and it removes a little bit of the paint at a time and creates soft edges. You can also use a tissue, paper towel, or a cotton swab for similar techniques. Here the paint is already dry, but I'm using a damp brush to do a similar lifting out technique. I'm putting water on this section and then I'm blotting it with a paper towel to remove the paint. Once again, I'm using cotton swabs, sponges, and pretty much anything absorbent you can try to remove paint from areas where you don't want it. Keeping in mind, certain colors may stain your paper, so no matter how much you try to lift them out, they may not remove completely. A magic eraser is another tool you can use to try to remove color from your painting. It works really well if you tape off a section and then you can control where it erases, or if you just want to create some lighter effects, then you can just go in and erase in random areas. In this area, I'm painting some color so that I can show you the effect of regular table salt on the paint. We carefully sprinkle the salt on. You want to use just a little bit, you don't want to overdo it. But then we'll have to wait for this area to dry before we can remove the salt. For a different kind of effect, you can use rubbing alcohol. It's most effective if you drop it on, one drop at a time, and it creates these large circle drop areas. One thing I've learned is that it works best if the paint is still pretty wet, and if you let it dry too long, then you won't get the same effect. In the last section on the page, I'm going to show you the effects of opaque watercolor versus transparent watercolor. Most watercolor paints are transparent, but there are a few colors that tend towards more opaque, as you can see here. I put down a line with a Sharpie marker, and then I went over it with 2 colors that are opaque and 3 colors that are transparent. Now I'm putting paint down over the masking fluid and masking tape areas. This will have to dry completely before the tape and the masking fluid can be removed. The whole idea of negative painting is that you're putting paint around the object that you want to focus on. Sometimes this is to leave areas white, and sometimes it's to put emphasis on a shape that might be lighter in color than the surrounding area. You can get really nice effects here as you layer the paint colors. And back to the glazing area. This is another type of layering of the paint. Watercolor, because of its transparent nature, will show the color of the paint that's underneath it. And as you can see here with the yellow paint, even though the green paint was completely dry, it lifted some of the color up with it. Scratching into this dry paint is a little tricky. You have to use a pretty sharp tool to get down to the paper layer. I'm using a stick here that has a pointy end, and I'm also using a craft knife, an X-Acto knife. And you're gently scraping off the layer of paint, and you will scratch into the paper. So it's important that you have a thick enough watercolor paper to do the technique. Now I'm removing the salt with a tissue. You could also use your fingers, but you want to make sure they don't have any moisture on them. As you can see, this creates a little starburst effect. Finally, we get to remove the masking tape and the masking fluid. I'm using my fingernail to peel off the masking tape carefully. You could also use a craft knife for this too. I'm sure there's some people who disagree with me on this, but I think a fingertip is the easiest tool to use to remove the dried masking fluid from your paper. You can just gently roll off the tacky masking fluid that's dry, and it leaves the white of the paper underneath it. Now, of course, there's a lot of hard edges here, so if you want to soften them up, then you can use a damp brush and gently go and soften the edges. It all depends on the effect that you're looking for. Thank you for watching my video on basic watercolor techniques.